Welcome to our deep dive, this time into Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Now, this book, it's more than just a historical account of his experiences, right? It's a deep look into the human spirit, that resilience and how we can find meaning even when faced with unimaginable suffering.
It really is, and what I find fascinating is how Frankl takes his own experiences and uses them to help us understand the human condition as a whole. It's not just him telling his story, it's like a psychological exploration.
You're right. It's a powerful mix of personal story and deep philosophical insight. So this book, it comes out of the horrors of the Holocaust. So how can it offer us guidance today?
Well, through his experiences, Frankl developed logotherapy, a theory that challenges traditional psychology. It puts the will to meaning as our primary drive, even stronger than the drive for pleasure or power.
Okay, this idea of the will to meaning, it sounds kind of abstract. Can you help me understand how this played out in the concentration camps?
Imagine everything you know is suddenly gone. Your home, your possessions, even your identity. These prisoners, they were reduced to numbers, their humanity, seemingly erased.
It's just so hard to even imagine that level of dehumanization. In those circumstances, wouldn't the will to just survive be the strongest instinct?
You'd think so. But Frankl, he observed something interesting. Those who just clung to the hope of survival, they often didn't fare as well as those who found a reason to live beyond simply existing.
So in a place where death was always present, meaning became a source of strength.
Absolutely. There's this story Frankl tells about a fellow prisoner who was deeply depressed, ready to give up. But then he got a letter from his wife, and that rekindled his hope, gave him a reason to keep fighting.
Wow, that is powerful. A simple letter and it becomes a lifeline. But not everyone had that kind of external support. How did they find meaning in such bleak circumstances?
In different ways. They found it in acts of kindness, small moments of beauty, even in humor, can you believe that? They found ways to connect with themselves, with something bigger than their suffering.
I'm really struck by this idea of humor in a concentration camp. It seems almost impossible.
It might seem that way, but Frankl and the other prisoners used humor as a defense mechanism, a way to detach even for a moment from the horrors around them. They tell jokes, share stories, and even find ways to laugh at the absurdity of their situation.
That must have taken so much courage, so much resilience. It wasn't just about surviving physically, it was about mental and emotional survival, too.
Exactly. And that resilience, Frankl argues, it came from their ability to find meaning, even in the worst possible circumstances.
Okay, so now I'm curious about the journey from that point, surviving with meaning to developing logotherapy. How did these experiences shape his theory?
Frankl, he noticed that when prisoners arrived at the camp, they went through these psychological adjustments. He broke it down into 3 phases. The first phase.
Hold on, before we get into those phases, can we take a step back? I think it's important to really understand what Frankl faced when he arrived at Auschwitz. That initial shock, that moment when he entered the abyss. Can you walk us through that?
Oh, absolutely. It's a moment that's so vividly captured in his book. He describes the chaos of the selection process, the brutal efficiency of the guards, being stripped of his possessions, including a manuscript he had, one that contained his life's work.
It's that moment with the manuscript that really got to me. He tries so hard to save it, and he's just met with this dismissive shit from another prisoner.
It's such a powerful detail, isn't it? That one word, it sums up the utter loss he felt and the realization that his old life, his old values, they didn't mean anything in this new reality.
It must have been a huge blow psychologically, facing the loss of not only his freedom, but the culmination of his intellectual pursuits.
Absolutely. And it's here we encounter this term, the Muslim. It was used in the camps to describe prisoners who had given up, both physically and mentally.
It's a chilling term, but it speaks to that deep despair that was all around them in the camps. So was becoming a Muslim inevitable in such a dehumanizing environment?
Not necessarily. You see, Frankl observed that even in those extreme circumstances, a glimmer of hope, a sense of meaning, it could make all the difference. And this observation, it led him to define the 3 phases of psychological adjustment he witnessed.
Okay, so let's delve into those phases. What was the first one?
Well, the first phase was that initial shock, that feeling of utter disbelief and despair that hit the prisoners when they entered the camp. Many contemplated suicide during this phase, and not necessarily from fear of death itself, but as a way to kind of take back some control, in a situation where they felt completely powerless.
So even facing death, that desire for control, for choice, it was still powerful.
Exactly. And Frankl himself, he even considered it suicide, I mean. But he ultimately rejected the idea. He reasoned that, well, the odds of survival were already so low that taking his own life wouldn't really change his fate.
It's a chilling calculation, but it makes sense. It really highlights the mental and emotional gymnastics that people were forced to do in those circumstances. So what about the second phase? What was that like?
Apathy, emotional numbness. It was like a defense mechanism, a way to protect yourself from the constant suffering.
It makes me think of what I've read about soldiers in wartime, how they develop this kind of emotional detachment to cope with the trauma. Is it similar to that?
Yeah, very much so. It's the mind's way of protecting itself from just being overwhelmed by the horror. Frankl describes these punishment parades. Prisoners were forced to march hours in the mud and cold. And at first, the new prisoners were horrified, of course. But as they entered the second phase, they became desensitized. They just watched with this detached indifference.
It really shows how adaptable humans can be, even to the most horrific conditions. But that kind of detachment, while it might be protective in the short term, it had to have some long-term consequences, right?
Of course. And that leads us to the third phase, readjustment to life after liberation. This phase, it was often more difficult than anyone expected.
That's so strange, isn't it? You'd think liberation would be pure joy and relief, but it sounds like it was much more complicated.
It was. So many survivors, they struggled with this feeling of depersonalization,
Yeah.
bitterness, disillusionment. The world they came back to, it felt alien. They felt like strangers in their own lives.
Frankel, he describes this feeling of disconnect, right? Like not belonging. He talks about walking through a field after liberation and feeling angry at the thought of not trampling the crops.
Yeah, exactly. That story captures it perfectly. This struggle to readjust to a world that now had completely different rules. After years of being treated as less than human, it was so hard to just jump back into normal life.
It's a reminder that the trauma didn't just end when they were liberated. The psychological and emotional scars, they continued to affect them long after.
And it shows us how important it is to understand the long-term impact of trauma, not just for Holocaust survivors, but for anyone who's been through hardship and loss.
So we've explored these phases of adjustment. I think now's the time to dig into the core of Frankel's theory, this will to meaning. You mentioned it challenges traditional psychology. Can you unpack that a little?
Well, Frankl, he believed this will to meaning is a basic human drive, more fundamental than the drive for pleasure or power, which is what Freud focused on. He quotes Nietzsche, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow."
That's a powerful quote. It suggests that even when you're suffering, having a purpose, a reason for being, it can give you the strength to go on. But how did that play out, practically speaking? How did prisoners actually find meaning in those dehumanizing conditions?
It varied. Some found it in acts of resistance, even small things like refusing to give up their dignity. Others found it in helping fellow prisoners, sharing their little bit of food or offering a word of encouragement.
So even in that environment, human connection, compassion, it still played a role.
Absolutely. And some found meaning in intellectual pursuits, like Frankl himself. He actually mentally rewrote that lost manuscript. It was an act of creation, of preserving his intellectual legacy, and that gave him a reason to keep going.
It's incredible the power of the mind to go beyond the physical circumstances.
Right, and it shows how important it is to have something to look forward to, something that gives your life direction. For Frankl, it was a belief that his work could help others understand suffering and overcome it.
It seems like this idea of finding meaning in something bigger than yourself comes up a lot. Was that something he actually encouraged?
He did. He truly believed that meaning often lies outside of us, in our connection to other people, to a cause, to something greater than ourselves.
And he didn't shy away from the idea that suffering itself could be a source of meaning. That's something a lot of people struggle with, including me. Can you help us understand that a bit better?
Frankl didn't think suffering was good in itself. But he did argue that even in suffering we can't avoid. We can choose our attitude. We can find meaning in how we respond to it.
I keep thinking about that story of the prayer he found in the pocket of his coat. It was just a scrap of paper, but it became this symbol of hope for him.
It was a powerful reminder of his spiritual heritage. It gave him a sense of connection to something bigger, even in the midst of all that loss and despair.
It really is amazing how even something seemingly small can become so meaningful when you're facing adversity.
It really is. And Frankl, he noticed that even in the concentration camp, prisoners could find these moments of joy, little flickers of hope that helped them get through.
I can't imagine finding joy in a place like that. What kind of things are we talking about?
It could be anything, really, like not being sent to Mauthausen, which was known for its brutality, or finding out you're being sent to a camp without a crematorium, which is what happened to Frankel when he was transferred.
It makes you realize how much perspective matters and how we experience suffering. Something that seems small to someone on the outside, it can be a huge victory for someone living through that.
Exactly. And this idea leads us to another key concept, the relativity of suffering.
The relativity of suffering. What does that mean?
It means that the amount of suffering we experience isn't just about what's actually happening, but how we see it, how we understand it.
So it's not about comparing our suffering to other people's, but about how we experience it individually, right?
Yes. He observed that prisoners would often envy those who seemed to have it worse. For instance, they might envy those on work details that were more dangerous, or working outside in the freezing cold.
That's so interesting. Why would they envy those people?
Because those tougher experiences, they offered a sense of purpose, a feeling of control that they didn't have in other parts of camp life.
It's kind of a paradox, isn't it? But it speaks to that human need for meaning and purpose, even in the face of so much suffering.
It does. And it challenges us to really think about how we see suffering. What we see as hardship might actually be a source of growth and in a way, even fulfillment.
This brings us to another really surprising aspect of Frankel's story, humor. You mentioned earlier that he and his fellow prisoners used humor as a way to cope. Can you tell us more about that?
You know, even in the darkest times, Frankl believed humor could be a powerful tool. He and the other prisoners found ways to laugh at the absurdity of their situation. It was a way to create these little moments of lightness and connection in the midst of all that darkness.
Do you have a particular example that comes to mind?
Well, there's this great anecdote about Frankl and his friend, a surgeon. They would imagine these scenarios from their lives after a liberation, like the surgeon being in the operating room and an orderly rushes in shouting, "Action! Action!" just like the foreman did in the camp.
Oh, wow. That's dark humor, but it's also so clever. It shows their resilience, finding those little bits of humor in such horrific circumstances.
Right. And it reminds us to not take ourselves too seriously, even when we're facing huge challenges.
It's a good reminder that sometimes laughter is the best medicine, even when everything around you seems to be falling apart.
And speaking of finding strength in unexpected places, we have to talk about Frankl's belief in the power of choice.
That's one of the most empowering messages, I think. Even in the worst situations, we still have the freedom to choose our attitude.
Frankl really emphasized that point. He even tells a story about having a chance to escape the camp. He had this opportunity to flee with a colleague, but he decided to stay. It must have been such a hard decision to make.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. Why did he stay?
It came down to loyalty, to his friends, his patients, and this sense of responsibility to his work. Frankl really believed that even in the face of that kind of suffering, we still have the freedom to choose our attitude, to choose how we respond.
That's what he calls attitudinal heroism, right? It's a powerful idea. Even when we can't control what's happening to us, we can still control how we react.
Exactly. And that inner freedom, that choice, it's what makes us human. Frankl believed that even in a concentration camp, there was this space between something happening and our reaction to it. And in that space, we could choose.
That space, that ability to choose, it seems like such a small thing in the midst of all that darkness. Did Frankl talk about how to cultivate that inner freedom, especially in such extreme circumstances?
He believed that finding meaning was the key. Finding meaning in your suffering, in your connections with others, in your connection to a cause, to something bigger than yourself. That's what gave you the strength to endure, to make choices that were true to yourself, even when those choices were really, really hard.
That makes me think of the story about the woman who was dying in the camp, the one who found comfort in talking to a chestnut tree.
Oh, yes, that story.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of finding meaning and connection even when facing death. She chose to see beauty and life in that tree, and it gave her a sense of peace, a sense of purpose, even in her final days.
We've talked about so much. Frankl's time in the camp, those phases of adjustment, the will to meaning, the idea that suffering is relative, how humor can be a weapon, and the power of choice. But what about life after the camps? What was it like for the survivors, coming back to a world that had kept moving without them?
You know, liberation was joyful, of course, but it also presented a whole new set of challenges. Frankl describes this feeling of depersonalization, like being disconnected from the world he used to know.
So it's like, even though they were free, they didn't quite fit in anymore, almost like strangers.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Many survivors had trouble reconnecting with their loved ones, finding their place in a society that felt like it had moved on without them. Even simple things, like enjoying food, appreciating nature, those things were difficult, almost like their ability to feel joy was damaged.
Frankl talks about seeing a rooster after he was liberated, a symbol of life, freedom, but he felt nothing. It took time for those feelings to come back.
Yeah, it's a powerful image. It reminds us that healing from trauma takes time. It's a long process.
Hmm.
And there was a lot of bitterness, too, toward the people who hadn't experienced the horrors of the camps firsthand, the ones who'd say, "We didn't know," or "We suffered too."
I can see how those words would feel empty to someone who had lived through something so unimaginable. It must have been hard to bridge that gap, that difference in experience.
It was. And for some, there was this terrible disillusionment when they got home. Loved ones were gone. The life they remembered didn't exist anymore.
It shows us that trauma doesn't just vanish when the situation changes. The psychological and emotional wounds, they can be deep. They can take a long time to heal.
And that's why Frankl's message about meaning is so important. It's not about forgetting the past, but finding a way to make it part of a life that's still worth living.
It's about understanding that even after tragedy, there's still room for growth, for finding purpose and connection. Frankl doesn't give us easy answers, but he does give us a way to think about those tough questions.
He reminds us that the meaning of life isn't some big universal truth, but something we each have to figure out for ourselves. It's about taking responsibility for our own lives, finding meaning in the things we do, the challenges we face, even the everyday stuff.
He compares life to a movie, right? Each moment has meaning, and the whole meaning of the film unfolds as it plays out.
I love that analogy. It shows us that life isn't about waiting for some grand revelation. It's about looking for meaning in the everyday things, the small moments.
So what does all this mean for us today? Frankl's story might seem so far removed from our own lives, but what can we learn from it? What can we take away and apply to our own experiences?
I think Frankl's message is ultimately one of hope, of resilience. He's telling us that even when things are hard, we have the power to choose how we react, to find meaning and purpose. He encourages us to look for that meaning in our relationships, in our work, in our connection to something bigger than ourselves.
It's a call to action, isn't it? To live our lives with courage, with a sense of purpose, to face our challenges head on and never stop looking for meaning.
If Frankl could find meaning in a concentration camp, then we can certainly find it in our own lives, no matter what we're going through.
His book is truly a gift. It shows us the incredible strength of the human spirit. If you haven't read Man's Search for Meaning yet, I can't recommend it enough. It's a book that will stay with you. And remember, the search for meaning, it's a lifelong journey. There will be ups and downs, but as Frankl reminds us, even in the darkest times, there's always a light, a spark of hope that can lead us toward a life that's truly worth living.